Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
And I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Thursday, May 30th, 2024. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Dr. Eviane Leidig, author of The Women of the Far Right, Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalization. And later in the show, Kate Wagner of The Nation will be with us to talk about how luxury brands are buying up our cities. Also on the program, Israel has seized and sealed the 9-mile Egypt-Gaza border. Rafah is right near that part. 2 more Biden officials resign in protest of Biden's Gaza policy, accusing the administration of lying about Israel obstructing humanitarian aid. Lobbying group Democratic Majority for Israel sends out a memo assuring Democratic lawmakers that support for Israel's genocide won't hurt them at the polls. But in totally unrelated news, an NPR Marist poll came out, shows Biden's approval rating with voters 18 to 29 is at 24%. He won that group by 20 points in 2020. Day 2 of jury deliberations in the Trump hush money trial. After over 4 hours of deliberation yesterday, Trump apparently offered Elon Musk an advisory role on the border if he wins. Translation, please just give me money. I need that for my lawyer's fees. Elon, please. France, Germany, and now some U.S. officials signal openness to letting Ukraine use U.S. weapons to strike Russia proper. This could draw NATO into the war, and the U.S. is a part of that. 2 nuclear powers here. Hope it's just posturing. Alito refuses to recuse himself from Trump election cases. No surprise there. Federal regulators give Boeing a deadline for a safety improvement plan. Hong Kong court convicts 14 pro-democracy activists. Polls close in South Africa, results expected over the weekend. Mexico will also hold its elections this weekend. And lastly, India recorded a temperature of 126 degrees Fahrenheit on Wednesday, potentially the highest ever recorded in the country. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome to the show, everybody. It's a Majority Report Thursday, and it is just myself and Matt Leck today. Bradley is moving. It's, it's that time of the month.
You always move every month?
No, not me. But did you know in Boston, I know this just because my stepsister lives in Boston, there's one day of the month where all the leases start and they all move on the same day. It's sometime in September or something like that. At least maybe the legal leases. But it creates a completely chaotic situation. And my stepbrother had to go help her move and stay in a hotel, and the hotels are overbooked. I mean, it's crazy.
Moving trucks in all the streets.
Yes. And they have to hire movers from completely out of the city.
Because they're all booked on that day?
Yes. Why does that happen? But at the end of the month in New York, it also is the time when you see a bunch of moving trucks and then when people's leases are up. So good luck to Bradley on
I'll totally be there helping you lift furniture, Bradley, but got this job to do. So.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we'd be there to help you out. A friend always will hypothetically offer to help you move, but maybe not in practice.
Got to do these clips.
I mentioned this in headlines, but just wanted to read a little bit before we talk briefly about the Trump trial before we get to some of our guests. Two more Biden administration officials have resigned in protest of Biden's position on Gaza. Particularly, this is, I think, notable because they are specifically accusing the administration of, and this is from The Guardian, not telling the truth about Israeli obstruction of humanitarian assistance to more than 2 million Palestinians trapped and starving in the tiny coastal strip. Alexander Smith, a contractor for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, said he was given a choice between resignation and dismissal after preparing a presentation on maternal and child mortality among Palestinians, which was canceled at the last minute by USAID leadership last week. Just sit with that for a second. He was preparing a report on infant and maternal or child and maternal mortality among Palestinians, and his report caused his higher-ups to say, well, you can either quit or we'll fire you.
Madness.
His quote is, I cannot do my job in an environment in which specific people cannot be acknowledged as fully human, or where gender and human rights principles apply to some but not to others, depending on their race, he wrote. In another resignation on Tuesday, a State Department official from the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, Stacey Gilbert, sent an email to colleagues explaining that she was leaving because of an official finding by the department that Israel was not deliberately obstructing the flow of food or other aid into Gaza. She was upset about the report to Congress earlier in May that we talked about, that basically danced around the issue and pretended that there was some ambiguity about whether or not Israel had violated the Leidig law in that instance. They didn't want to have to trigger the Leidig law, which says that if a country is blocking humanitarian assistance, they should be cut off from aid at that point. So the administration's report that they gave to Congress just didn't address that fact because they knew what the finding would mean for them legally, and that's part of why she chose to resign. Smith and Gilbert bring the total number of Biden administration officials to have publicly resigned over U.S. policy on Gaza to 9. Though Josh Paul, the first official to resign, said at least 24 more have left quietly without a public declaration. And more and more of this is going to happen if the administration determines Israel did not violate its red line. They're still figuring that out. I guess that investigation is lost with the World Central Kitchen aid worker attacks, the killing of 6-year-old girl Hind Rajab, and more. They're all just, it's a backlog.
You think about like why we don't want Trump to be the next president, and it's in part because of the effect it has on sort of the bureaucratic personnel, and we're already pruning the bureaucracy of anybody who has a conscience during the genocide. So basically doing their work for them. So that's why you hear all people talk about fascism as like a campaign issue. No, it's a bipartisan problem right now that we all have to really confront because it's happening right now. There's collaboration happening right now.
I am in favor of people resigning in protest to be public like this because it gives people, it puts more pressure on folks.
Absolutely.
But that is the consequence of having an inhumane policy like this, is that, this administration could have had all of these good-hearted people, Nell Sheeline, Josh Paul, whoever, right, who are trying to do good work.
Yeah. I just have brainless and, bloody-handed people left.
And there are still people that they need a job. I get it. It's really hard to be without a job in this country. And they're trying to maybe rationalize and do work from the inside. But if this many people are resigning in protest, just think about how many people internally are disgusted. Now, let's turn to Donald Trump and the trial. As I mentioned at the start of the show, this is day 2 of jury deliberations. I believe reporting right before we came on air indicated that the jury was trying to hear some testimony again. Now, before the jury deliberated, the judge gave instructions to the jury, as the judge does. But as soon as the judge did that, Trump, apparently within minutes, went on Truth Social and, of course, is crying foul. It is ridiculous, unconstitutional, and un-American that the highly conflicted radical left judge is not requiring a unanimous decision on the fake charges against me brought by Soros-backed DA Alvin Bragg. It's like, you see just the contours of great replacement theory right there. Soros, Jewish-backed a black guy, right? In the same way that they never attribute agency to black people or Latino people because it must be the Jews controlling
puppet master, not a Jewish puppet, just a puppet master.
Right. Don't worry. I'm against anti-Semitism. A third world election interference hoax, he says. Trump concludes that post. So that was right after the jury gave these instructions. And you saw every Republican candidate kind of follow suit after this. Or not candidate, I should say. Politician. Marco Rubio was like, this is disgusting what the judge did. And then last night, Senator Ted Cruz went on Sean Hannity's show to express consternation about these jury deliberation instructions. We'll give you the real facts of the situation after we hear him.
Happening with Jonathan Turley is exactly right. We now know to a virtual certainty that no conviction will be upheld on appeal, that the judge today committed, I think, clear reversible error. These jury instructions were nonsense. Now, here's the bad news. The bad news is this has been a kangaroo court from the beginning. This is a wildly partisan prosecutor who hates Donald Trump, who came with a political objective of going after Donald Trump. And we now know from these jury instructions that this judge is every bit the partisan that the prosecutor is. And he knows this is reversible error. As you noted, Ramos versus Louisiana clearly held in 2020 that every element of the crime must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, must be unanimous by the jury. And yet this judge says it doesn't matter, not in New York. The Constitution does not apply in New York, which means if we get a conviction, it will be reversed on appeal. But the judge doesn't care. The prosecutor doesn't care. Nobody cares because this is not about law. This is not about criminal justice. This is about politics. This is all about the press conference, the national address that Joe Biden has scheduled to give from the White House, where he gloats, we've now convicted Donald Trump. This is all about November. We are watching election interference. This is the most blatant case of election interference that we've ever seen in our country's history.
But everything seems to backfire. And if you look, for example, and I've heard different takes on the issue of the questions that the jury are asking, and there'll be a readback tomorrow. But I've got to wonder, could those questions be rooted in disagreement in that, jury room?
Look, Sean, I'm holding out hope. I got to say, I believe in our justice system. I believe in our Constitution. I believe in the rule of law.
I don't believe in this system. Senator, I said at the beginning, he can't get a fair trial in New York. Mar-a-Lago's not $18 million either. And I stand by it, and he didn't get a fair trial in New York, regardless of what the outcome is.
Yep.
That's a fact.
No. This judge is partisan and wildly unfair. The previous judge was partisan and wildly unfair.
Okay.
My hope is the best outcome is that the jury acquits, that there's some common sense that comes through. Now, as you noted, this jury pool is wildly Democratic, so they're gambling that they have partisans on that jury who don't care about the facts and law. And by the way, the judge gave them such a biased view of the law that they could have 12 different theories of the crime and convict. That will be reversed. But even so, even if they don't acquit, one juror can stand up and say, I will not be part of this travesty of justice. I hope and pray that happens. That would be good for the country if they ended this ridiculous charade and they let the voters decide in November.
All right.
I agree. Well said,
Thank you
Senator.
so much.
Appreciate you being with us.
Ted Cruz, for that advocacy for jury nullification, which definitely is not politicizing the process whatsoever, as he accuses all the Democrats, and we know what that means, in an urban space like New York. They're going to be the ones that are biased in this instance. So what they're basically claiming here, and what Trump is claiming, and all of the Republicans just followed suit with his Truth Social post that came off the cuff as the jury began to deliberate after these instructions were handed down. No, the judge is not saying that the let's rip up the Constitution in this case. For a felony charge, you don't need unanimous consent on the conviction. That is absolutely not what the judge said, because if that were the case, yes, that would be highly unusual and illegal for the judge to make that determination basically on the fly to the jury before they were set to make deliberate and figure out the facts of this case. What the judge actually said to them in thorough instructions was, because the prosecution in this case made the misdemeanor a felony in this instance, when it came to falsifying business records, they made it a felony by bumping it up to say the intent with this falsifying of records was to commit another crime, which was the federal crime of election interference. Because that was the way that the prosecution's case was constructed, the judge made the case to the jury and said, you don't necessarily need to agree on these 34 counts on the way that that Trump concealed or obfuscated or used this kind of fraudulent bookkeeping or changing of wording. You don't need to agree on every specific charge on the mechanism with which he did that. You just have to agree with the overarching charge. The overarching charge of that he was basically that they were trying to violate the election law through this fraudulent activity. They made this case here in USA Today. Basically, the prosecutors have alleged Trump falsified the records in order to interfere with the 2016 presidential election using unlawful means. They've alleged Trump used 3 different unlawful means. 1, violating federal campaign finance laws through hush money payments to adult film star Stormy Daniels. 2, falsifying yet another business record under New York law, such as bank records tied to former Trump fixer Michael Cohen's payment to Stormy Daniels' lawyer. And 3, violating New York tax laws. Jurors must agree Trump used some unlawful means to interfere in the election, according to Merchan, the judge, but they don't need to agree on which means it was. This is the quote from the instructions. Although you must conclude unanimously that the defendant conspired to promote or prevent the election of any person to public office by unlawful means, you need not be unanimous as to what those unlawful means were, Merchan instructed. But does the verdict need to be unanimous? Yes, Merchan clearly stated. Your verdict on each count you consider, whether guilty or not guilty, must be unanimous. That is, each and every juror must agree to it, he said. But they're claiming that it was the second part in which Merchan, the judge, was saying that the jurors did not have to be unanimous. Yeah, that would be a pretty massive story if that were the case. But they know this is it. I mean, they know that they're lying about this. They know that they're lying about the mechanics of it because it's going to make people confused, and that's their primary objective. So we'll see what happens. I mean, maybe... There we go. This is also amazing. So if you guys recall, now that, you know, we get to see Ted Cruz just suck up to Trump on a nightly basis or daily basis, apparently. You'll recall that the National Enquirer ran that story about Ted Cruz's father being linked to the JFK assassination, which was false. And David Pecker, Trump's guy at the National Enquirer, was just testifying in this very case that Trump and him were working in cahoots to do catch and kill schemes, but also plant stories like this one. So even with all of that backstory, Ted Cruz still gets all agitated on air on Hannity to protect the leader of the Republican Party, Donald Trump. So we shall see what the results are here, but that is the deliberate obfuscation that the GOP is engaging in today. All right, folks, quick break, and when we come back, we are going to be talking to Dr. Eviane Leidig, the author of Women on the Far Right, Social Media Influencers, and Online Radicalization. Be right back. are back, and we are joined now by Dr. Eviane Leidig, postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Culture Studies at Tilburg University, author of The Women of the Far Right, Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalization. Eviane, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. So the alt-right in particular is central to your book, the way basically that the far right branded itself from 2015, 2016 on. A lot of our viewers are familiar with these characters, but for those who are not, what are the hallmarks of the alt-right's views? What are the characteristics of the movement as you uncovered through your ethnographic research on this front?
Yeah, so I mean, I will say, let's go back. So I started my research for this book in 2019, which was at the time when the alt-right started to dwindle. But the way I think about the alt-right is that I often think about it as the political movement that helped to bolster Trump's election and presidency. And in addition to that, it has a lot of white supremacist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant views. And then that's kind of sort of a continuation of sort of what is the ideology of the extreme right. But I think what made the alt-right quite different, at least at that time, was also just how online it was in terms of we started to see it emerge on forums like 4chan, Reddit even, and then just got a lot more mainstream, right? So now it started to dominate places like Facebook and Twitter, YouTube, etc. And so when we think about the alt-right, in some ways, it kind of disintegrated, sort of, especially after January 6th. But I mean, it's still definitely there in terms of you still have a lot of the same activists who are on social media and sort of helping to still bolster the MAGA crowd. So in some ways it's disintegrated, but it's just sort of revamped in terms of how we might see it today.
Right. And when we talk about the alt-right, we often trace its origins back to Gamergate. And there's so much misogyny inherent in that scandal, which is why your focus on the women of the far right and the alt-right as well is so fascinating. But can you take us to that moment and kind of what Gamergate was, how it branched off into a very online political movement, or how you can see some of the trappings of that extended into the alt-right movement?
Yeah, for sure. So Gamergate erupted in 2014, and it was basically a massive harassment and doxing scandal against a journalist who was writing about gaming forums. And that definitely overlapped with what we would come to see as the political movement surrounding Trump and MAGA more broadly. But you're right in the sense that we tend to think about just these dudes who are chronically online that are part of, the alt-right with its origins in Gamergate. But the thing is, and also when we think about things like Unite the Right at Charlottesville in 2017, right? We also think about, guys wearing khakis, holding torches, saying you will not replace us. But the thing is, I knew that there were women, particularly women YouTubers, who are really big within this scene, but they just weren't getting taken seriously in the same way that the guys of the alt-right were. And I realized, maybe this is a strategic way of presenting themselves, right? Maybe they're choosing not to be as violent or as provocative in what they're saying, because they know that what they're saying still gives legitimacy to the right's ideological agenda, but it often slips under the radar. So that's why I was I need to write a book about women in the far right, because no one's really paying attention to them or taking them seriously.
Yeah. And to bolster what you're saying, I think when most people think of the alt-right, they primarily associate it with white men, right? Because of those images from Charlottesville and things like that. But we know that women have played a role in right-wing movements throughout history. I mean, whether it be Phyllis Schlafly, that's a pretty infamous example here in this country, or, obviously other female conservative politicians throughout time. But particularly the way they play a role in this movement is a very online role. So how do these alt-right or far-right female influencers present themselves to their audiences in order to kind of lure them into what they're selling, sometimes literally?
No, you're actually right. They are selling their brand and the movement.
Right.
I mean, a lot of these women started off as political commentators on YouTube or like reacting to current events. And I would think that was definitely the peak around 2016, 2017. But then I've noticed, particularly during COVID, a lot of these women started posting a lot more lifestyle content, like on Instagram. So they started posting about like food vlogging or health and wellness, which really like mutated with the anti-vax, and some of them jumped onto the QAnon conspiracy train as well. And that shift was actually really interesting, right? Because like this election season, I don't see them like outwardly talking about politics that much, at least not like during the 2016 election season. But they're choosing to sort of showcase a really different form of visual propaganda with their content, right? So they're trying to show like what a traditional nuclear family looks like in sort of the everyday like posting of like I'm making dinner with my kids or I'm gardening in the backyard. But it's still really political in terms of like, you know, the message that they're trying to get across and sort of this image of heteronormative families. And that's also why I'm starting to see overlap more with like the trad wife scene as well, which many people don't think it's very political, but it's actually all about like upholding certain racial and gender and class norms.
Yeah, what is the trad wife movement? This is one where I kind of have a sense, but I never felt the need to look into it that much.
Yeah, no, I applaud you for that. Yeah, so trad wife is short for traditional wife, and sort of the idea, and I mean, the idea is that you have like stay-at-home wives, and if their children to be mothers, and they sort of like retreat back into the domestic sphere, and then the idea is that like their husbands are the primary breadwinners working in public-facing jobs. There are very distinctly anti-feminist, and I think this is where you often see a lot of overlap with the far right, in terms of like believing that feminists like dominate and control mainstream society and prohibits women and men from quote unquote exercising like their natural biological femininity and masculinity. But a lot of trad wife content is this very leisurely, like making sourdough bread or like knitting or crocheting. It's this really more like, slow living and sort of against the girl boss or boss babe of feminism as they would allege it to be, right? Mm-hmm. So I doubt many of these women have read any feminist theory in their lives, but it's this really like reactionary movement against that.
Would they be into attitude. Intersectionality? I mean, I don't like the girl boss feminism either, but maybe we should send them some bell hooks and they'll be liberated. I mean, I don't know. I've seen some of those videos of like making gum for 5 hours where you could have just made it and bought it at CVS or whatever. But it's interesting. How much does that connect with like Christian influencers? There's a pretty big ecosystem of Christian influencers, and they typically portray heteronormativity as well. Is that a part of this, or is that distinct, or sometimes both?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say these are separate communities, but there's definitely some overlaps, particularly when it comes to like certain influencers who might be like religious as well as promoting a lot of the trad content. But I think, one thing, whether we're looking at like Christian influencers or trad wives or like the extreme right, the one thing that just always unites them is this anti-feminist stance. Right. And we also see that in like the manosphere, for example, or people like Andrew Tate.
Yeah, or Tim Pool. We covered this yesterday, where it's funny because societal ills are feminism's fault, right? In the sense where women are unhappy because they have to work, and so that's the fault of feminism. But also men are unhappy because of feminism, apparently, because they're lonely, and feminism is also making women more independent, but then also they hate that independence. So it's just funny how both men and female unhappiness is really just women's fault in the end of the day.
Yeah, and like that was actually a surprising theme that I found with my research, is that I was expecting a lot of these far-right women influencers to be radicalizing other women into the movement. But I actually found that, like, at least on YouTube, they had a lot more male followers. I mean, one of them said that she looked at her YouTube analytics and 85% of her viewers were male, which was like pretty astonishing to me, right? So like, and I think they know that, right? So they're tailoring to that male gaze with that demographic, and they're talking about things how society doesn't allow men to exercise natural forms of masculinity because of the feminists, right? So I think they're really adaptable in terms of appealing to both male and female viewers with their content.
I mean, I haven't seen our YouTube analytics, but from my experience, political content is pretty more male dominated, right? But this is not even as expressly political, right? In the sense that it's also about portraying a lifestyle and influencing. Can you talk about the ways that they either directly appeal to a male audience or do so through showing, not telling?
Well, it's sort of both, right? I mean, like sort of on this like superficial, very visual layer of course, the aesthetic is about like dressing extremely femininely and, participating in, certain household chores and behaviors that sort of show that woman's place should be sort of submissive to the husband in the household. But then, when they talk about sort of the anti-feminist stuff, or they talk about like how society is failing men, and I think, it depends a bit on the influencer that you're looking at. Some are a bit more open than others when it comes to talking about like political or even social issues. There it comes across much more in the sense of like, aren't you just lonely and sort of seeking that traditional wife that would sort of give you that happiness and sense of fulfillment? So that's when it veers more into being more explicit about their ideological views.
So, I mean, you put an emphasis on parasocial relationships as also being kind of key here. How do some of these influencers, and if you don't mind actually naming them, I think Lauren Southern, some people may be familiar with, but I'd also include, maybe she's not a part of it exactly, but Chaya Raichik has her own little niche in the right-wing movement, but particularly the more influencer type women, what is how do they attempt to kind of foster these parasocial relationships with their often largely male audience?
Yeah, I mean, so, and also for those who may not be so familiar with this term, like parasocial relationships means that audiences feel like they intimately know and feel close to an influencer or to a content creator. And so I sort of show throughout my research, things about like certain posting behaviors. And I mean, we can go all the way back to like the origins of YouTube in terms of like sort of crowdsourcing suggestions or people leaving comments on videos, like that really interactive and form of like interacting with their followers. But then I think, as a lot of these women started transitioning more to places like Instagram or TikTok, it became a lot more about like posting their everyday lives, things that seem relatively banal to us, but sort of establish this much more like holistic picture of themselves, right? So it's one thing to offer that political commentary. It's another to be like, this is what I'm cooking for dinner. Like, this is like my household chores that I'm doing for the day, right? And it just seems so mundane, but it's also part of just like establishing that sort of everyday relationship with their followers. For people like Lauren Southern, for example, it became a lot of like behind the scenes filming while she was like filming her documentaries or going on tours and giving speeches, right? So like posting a video of herself before she went on Tucker Carlson being like, join us live, at this time. And I would say like, this was definitely something that's transformed over the last few years, right? So when these women started off, I'd say in like 2015, 2016, like this was still relatively new in terms of like kind of soliciting that type of audience engagement in that way. But then over time, it's just been building so that it's become, I think, just part of like the everyday forms of social media interaction that we see.
Well, I mean, influencing is that, right? Where it's essentially an advertisement and it's non-traditional in the way where you build up that parasocial relationship with your audience on Instagram or TikTok, and then you're selling yourself, you're selling your lifestyle, and eventually you're selling some products and your lifestyle is mixed into there, right? So it's a long game for then being able to capitalize on it financially, and it plays on people's emotions in the way that Don Draper would be very proud. So like, what are some of those products that they're pushing? Because I know that some of these female right-wing influencers have relationships with platforms like TPUSA or PragerU.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think monetization is for some of them, probably their primary form of income generation, besides things like advertising revenue on YouTube. It's interesting because I started to see this sort of the sponsors that they were partnering with throughout different, let's say, crises. So, for example, during the pandemic, and especially at the height of BLM protests, there was one sponsor called My Patriot Supply, which sells like emergency survival kits. So, like 25 years of freeze-dried food or water filtration kits. Very Alex Jones vibe kind of stuff. And this sponsor was sponsoring several different influencers that I was studying at that time. And they were all pushing this, fear-mongering rhetoric about like an upcoming racial civil war in the US because of BLM. So that was one really big sponsor at that time. But then it became a lot of sponsors on stuff like health and wellness products, like skincare or beauty supplies, right? And again, like when it comes to the influencer space, beauty and wellness bloggers have long worked with corporate sponsors as a form of monetizing. But the messaging here was quite deliberate in terms of like trying to sell both an ideology and a lifestyle. So it speaks back to what you were saying about like creating that personal branding where people tend to, I think, literally consume like identity politics has become commercialized now. People are literally consuming the identity and feeling like they're part of that movement because they're literally buying products into this movement.
Right. So we had somebody write in and say, Lydia Rose says, I'd be curious to hear what the doctor thinks on alt-right trans women such as Blair White and how they fit into this as well. And I guess I brought up Chaya Raichik earlier, but the anti-trans movement also being a part of this as well, and that connecting to reinforcing gender roles as these women tend to do.
I mean, I would say in general, trans representation is pretty marginal. Like you'll find very few folks who are sort of visibly out there in terms of like their trans identity. By and large, it is a deeply transphobic and just broadly anti-LGBTQ movement in general. And I think it's really interesting because in like 2018, 2019, I started to see this anti-trans rhetoric start to escalate amongst these far-right actors in ways that were still considered to be kind of fringe. But of course, now we're seeing like a lot of fear-mongering around trans rhetoric and sort of associations with grooming and with perversion and such, right? But like that's something that used to be pretty fringe, and now it's just become so mainstream.
Small D Democrat writes in, our viewers have questions for you. Can you ask her about Pearl and why she's so bad at the alt-right woman grift? What's this psycho's last name? Pearl
Davis. Yeah.
Pearl Davis. Yeah.
Oh, Pearl. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because there's actually quite a lot of trad wives who don't like Pearl, which is because
she's too inflammatory.
She's too inflammatory, and like she also disses parts of the trad community, right? Because I would say like she's definitely more a female version of somebody like Andrew Tate rather than somebody who's vehemently pushing for traditionalist views, right? Like I think she sticks more to like the anti-feminist stance rather than like say we gotta go back to the 1950s sort of.
Is she even married? Yeah. I mean, she can't be a part of this space if she hasn't been locked down at this point. I mean, what does she even have to say?
Yeah, I don't know if she's married. I think someone should Google that.
Right.
Let us know in the comments. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting that they reject her in that way. I mean, maybe it's just because she's like she's like the Rabbi Shmuley of Zionism, where it's like you're just going on to go on cable hits, but you're not representing our horrible movement well.
She's not married.
Oh, she's not married. There you go. So she can't be a part of the club, I guess. So lastly, before we wrap up here, you also talk about the recruitment into some of these far-right spaces, particularly via these female alt-right influencers. What does that look like, and how can, I guess, people identify if, say, someone in their life is listening to these folks and maybe going down this path?
Yeah, I mean, so when it comes to things like recruitment and radicalization, so I've heard these women talk about so many different strategies that they use, right? So on the one hand, they might be appealing to to young women who are already trad cats, like people who like sort of grew up in conservative religious upbringings, and those are very easy targets for them. But for others, they talk about themselves being quote unquote recovering feminists. So they'll try to target women who might grow up with really progressive views and then sort of start to feel really unhappy with their life situation. Again, talking about, the sort of anti-girl boss mindset. And so for these far-right women, they'll be like, I was like you, I had these really feminist views, but now I'm recovering from that. And like, if you turn to traditionalism, that is your antidote to feminism. So they sell this myth.
And so for men too, what they offer, like you can find a wife like me, kind of.
I would say for men, yeah, it's a lot of like honey trapping. It's definitely a lot of like, if you join our movement, you're going to find a traditional submissive wife. I would say it's pretty superficial in that way. But they also tell young men, like, if you join far right groups, like you can sort of exercise traits of aggression and dominance and leadership, because at the end of the day, these influencers are one of the few female faces of the movement, but by and large, women are pretty invisible when it comes to the far right more broadly, and it's the men that are sort of dominating the top of the hierarchy. So they basically encourage young men to join those movements and be able to exercise that. But yeah, the question about like how can we spot the signs, because that's pretty hard. And I'll say that, like, I've been studying the far right for several years, and even there's times where I'm like, is this actually far right, or is this more just like this trad escapist fantasy content that I'm looking at? And I'll have friends send me videos and ask, like, is she one of those far right women that you've studied? But I think ultimately, despite the fact that we have a lot of like algorithmic amplification of this content, it definitely comes down to, identifying what are people's personal grievances before they turn to hate. Because for a lot of the women I study, they talked about like being red pilled, but then like losing a lot of family and friends after turning towards these radical views, and how painful that was for them, right? So I think that early intervention, if you see someone starting to post some of this red pilling content, just be there and ask questions, right? Like just be there and be like, okay, like what's going on? Like, why are you interested in this stuff? And I think just that early intervention, even if it may not be successful at first, it just shows that like people want to feel that they need that consolidation, that they need that attention and validation, right? So I think that's just one really important thing to think about.
All right, truly last question, because Morpheus writes in, and this is actually I am curious about your thoughts on this. Does she have any thoughts on the intersection between anti-feminist trad white folks and American Catholicism? It seems like there's a lot of overlap to me. I think that fits into the Harrison Butker speech that we saw a few weeks ago. I'm not sure if you were following that, but.
Yeah, it's not an area that like I'm totally following, but like I have read about some of those overlaps. I would say that actually I've looked a lot more into Mormonism and sort of like the trad anti-feminist content, because actually some of the top trad wife influencers are Mormon, and it's really good because they rarely talk about religion, they never talk about politics. It's all just really this aesthetic, like look at my family of 10 kids, So yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for that. But I mean, I think we could go into a loophole around all the different sort of religious communities and how it overlaps with the trad.
Yeah, but I think the Catholicism thing is a little bit more, it's a little newer, right? There's this kind of, it's something emerging maybe that was a little bit past some of the research that you did. But anyway, the book is fascinating. This is tailor-made for our audience. It's called The Women of the Far Right, Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalization. Dr. Eviane Leidig, we will put a link to your book wherever people are listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. All right, folks, quick break, and when we come back, we'll be with Kate Wagner. We are back, and we are joined now by Kate Wagner, journalist based in Chicago, architecture critic for The Nation magazine, whose latest piece for The Nation is entitled Luxury Brands Are Buying Our Cities. Kate, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So, we've talked, you mentioned this in your piece, and I didn't even know that someone else had said it before me, the Disneyification of our cities. I guess that was not coined by me, so I won't, I'll revoke my trademark of that phrase. But I mean, like, basically, we've been speaking about this trend for quite a while, this desire, I think, by people in power in our cities around the country and internationally, as you write, basically to have our spaces be theme parks for brands or to go see a show or something like that. And your piece touches on this a lot about how luxury brands are trying to buy up so much real estate in our cities for them to have basically open air malls. Can you speak about this dynamic, I guess, of how these corporations are working to buy up our cities?
Yeah, definitely. For me, what's really interesting is the scale at which they're doing it. For example, Louis Vuitton, LVMH, which is their conglomerate name, which I think is Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, has bought up to 3.5 billion euros in real estate since 2007. And the funny thing about this is that this is actually funded by its private equity arm. It has stakes in a private equity firm, which is like really interesting, this dynamic between private equity and land acquisition and things like, for example, the wholesale gutting of the American retail landscape, which is also done by private equity. And so all of these different dynamics at play are really fascinating. And it's crazy that this company, which sells mostly handbags as in fashion, as people know, have bought entire swaths of cities. It's not just like, okay, they have some buildings on Fifth Avenue and in Paris, which makes sense because those are already kind of luxury hubs and have been for an extremely long time. But what's more interesting to me is that they have bought land in Miami and Montreal that is basically at a neighborhood scale, and has created from scratch these whole-scale neighborhoods that show and demonstrate a complete control over all spatial processes, as though they're kind of acting as a real estate developer and as an urban planner, which is not a role we typically think of companies playing when they buy real estate. We don't necessarily think of them as designing or as like being involved in, like, I don't know, the building scale. And so it just goes to show you exactly how much power and money such a company has that they're able to do this.
Yeah. Can you give people a sense of what that control looks like when they're able to have so much real estate space where they're creating their own, like, almost park-like structures or places where their brand, people can just go and be immersed in the brand even more than, I don't know, going to crypto.com arena in Los Angeles or something like that. I mean, these brands have already bought up all our arenas and now they're buying up our public spaces.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So there's two kind of ways that they're doing this. The first is more of this old school 90s kind of Bilbao effect named after this museum by Frank Gehry, which is kind of credited with the Bilbao Guggenheim, which is credited with revitalizing the waterfront in Bilbao in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And cities tried to replicate this basically across a lot of post-industrial parts of their cities. For example, like Hamburg also has, a giant concert hall in its kind of wharf area. And so that's one way of doing it, is by this big kind of gaudy building. I hate that building. I think it's really terrible. I like Frank Gehry, but I went to that building last year, and when you see it, it is the first thing you see is Louis Vuitton in big sparkling Paris Hilton letters. And it feels like going into a mall for art. It is so safe. It is so dull. It is so Instagrammable. But then when you get to something like the Miami development, then you're really talking more of an open air mall. Because, for example, like in their words, in the company's words, they control the neighborhood experience, whatever that means, to which tenants can rent there. I think they mean commercial tenants by that. And of course, they have this goofy AstroTurf public art, which is, not a substitute for real art, which actually takes low rents and autonomy and mess to make. And so it's crazy. Just they control like the trees. I mean, they really are. It is a mall.
Right.
I think that's the clearest way but it's like a mall that is public on public streets. Arguably, these kinds of things are a kind of substitute for what really should be happening, which is cultivating places where artists can thrive, because they can't in cities anymore. The rent is too high. Or even just like the city should buy up this land and do placemaking, if you want to call it that. Like do parks, do outdoor dining, do all of this stuff. It's crazy that we just let these companies, and by the way, often without taxing them, to basically be kind of private Robert Moseses in cities.
This is what you were referencing here, right? Matt pulled this up. What was the name of this again? This image that we're seeing here?
Oh,
Kate?
This image. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Do you see that?
This is the Guggenheim Bilbao, which is a
yeah.
very famous art museum in Bilbao, Spain, on the waterfront. It was credited with the revitalization of that city in a kind of post-industrial way. Though it's unlikely that it was the sole contributor. I think architecture always ascribes too much importance to itself.
Certainly.
But yeah, this is clearly their tactic in Paris that they're trying to go for, which goes to show you how much money they have. And actually, the crazy thing about that building is that even though it was reported to only cost 134 something, I don't know, $1 million, like it's more and more likely that the estimated cost is 900 million, which is like that's almost $1 billion.
What's the discrepancy? Well, why is there that discrepancy in what's been reported and how much it costs?
Frank Gehry is kind of known for going over budget because his buildings are extremely complex. But it's not just that. Like, for example, according to ArtNet, there's a report by the French Court of Auditors, which revealed that in the first 11 years of its existence, the Fondation Louis Vuitton, which is the museum in Paris, benefited from $589 million in tax cuts.
Or tax breaks for them? Or tax
exactly.
Cuts?
Through basically like a corporate loophole in the tax code, because they are going to give the museum to Paris in 2062. And so therefore it's like seen as like a public investment or whatever. But I mean, I think that's actually really $589 million in tax cuts for basically just like a glorified Instagram pop-up.
Yeah.
On public land, it's on a public park. And so you're really just talking about the wholesale robbing of the city coffers by this company, and then just kind of trying to compensate with it by way of this building. It's being like, no, it's okay. Like, we did a cool thing that we will eventually give to the city. But it's really, I find it quite gross.
Especially if it's on top of a park, right? I mean, we've been talking on the show about public space being enclosed upon, encroached upon by the city, by our cities for decades at this point. And I mean, there really is, I think, something sadly ironic about these museums that are supposed to be hubs of art or hubs of culture being a part of making our cities into that Disneyland type place and gentrifying it, right? Or making it so unlivable because costs are so expensive. Because cities are supposed to be where art is created, or artists come to find each other and experiment. And that's part of what is like we revere about artists in the past, is that they've been able to come to New York or come to Paris and experiment and do the arts. But it's making it impossible for people to even live here in the name of what they say is art, which is really just branded billionaire content.
Yeah, exactly. I think that there is a real divide between art that is kind of appropriated for this purpose. And then this is not an old thing, right? Like, for example, in the Gilded Age, philanthropic foundations created museums in cities around the world. And it was problematic then as it is now. The difference is that like the museums don't actually really, these kinds of museums to me, like, well, the Fondation Louis Vuitton especially, which is really just like the things they have in there, like Matisse cutouts, you know what I mean? things that people already know that's really safe, that they want to take pictures with. That really is quite a different approach to museum curation, I think, than even like in this kind of Gilded Age sense of just accumulating private collections and then opening them up to the public. But it really isn't public. When I went there, I was really shocked because there were just people taking pictures everywhere. And there's this giant Louis Vuitton logo. And it's like, I've been to the Guggenheim in Bilbao, and that is a very expensive museum, but it is also a museum. And this felt more like the Vessel to me, which was like a kind of real estate scheme for taking pictures. Yeah. And I think that this is just a Gilded Age capitalist concept that was already entrenched in the way capitalism works, that has just been adapted to the aesthetics and media landscape of today. It's not new. It's merely just the kind of tech age, Gilded Age that we live in now, taken to the logical extreme, which is luxury brands making neighborhoods.
Right. And I wanted to return to the private equity piece that you mentioned at the beginning, because private equity and commercial real estate are, I think, contributing to much of it's a separate, I guess, ecosystem from housing, but it does compound upon itself, specifically in urban environments, when commercial real estate is gobbling up so much of the available space. How is private equity working in this real estate economy to kind of consolidate a lot of a lot of money in the real estate industry?
Yeah, so definitely, I think that private equity, in a lot of cases, a lot of companies either have their own private equity arms, or they are highly invested in private equity firms and hold like very large shares of those firms. And so this is basically just cash flow, I think, for a lot of these companies. The way that we, as people who live in cities, experience private equity is very different than the way that capitalists work with it. For them, it's a matter of basically like getting money and just like taking things that are already existing, that often are profitable, and just basically torching them for more money. There's no kind of more elegant way of putting that. That is what it does. And so when we actually experience this spatially, we experience it as store closures, for one, like, for example, like strip malls, or in a dead mall, or brands that are like legacy brands that get completely gutted by private equity, like department stores, for example, and it's just a slow decline into basically abandonment. And so it's interesting, this dynamic between the kind of private equity that does all kinds of shadowy things, but this is just one of them, and the spatial effect that has on our lives and what that money is used for, which is basically remaking the world in the image of the rich. It's a very kind of, I consider it a very kind of one-to-one reverse Robin Hood.
Yeah. Right.
Take from the rich to also give to the rich. Like, okay.
Yeah. And when you talk about like this basically being, the branded Robert Moses tactic, essentially, these conglomerates buying up all of this public space, like, can you talk a bit about some of the effects on people and how that took over places where maybe there was a public park, or it was a space where people could have a communal kind of connection, versus now this is a branded area, a branded park for Louis Vuitton. I mean, I can't even imagine, like, for unhoused residents too, the space where they have the ability to just rest is shrinking and shrinking as well.
I mean, definitely. I think that this is a very clear kind of spatial class war. Not to be dramatic, but I mean, this is how the world is working right now, which is that we see the erasure of not only public space, but also just like ordinary life, and the backdrop of life that all architecture provides. And what happens is it gets completely smoothed by these processes, by gentrification, by overpolicing, by private equity, by any of these things, by tax cuts from cities that let corporations do whatever they want. And so what you're really seeing is the this is a space of exclusion. I don't know how, like, that's the only way I can put it, is that this is a space of total exclusion. Like, if you're talking about, these are brands that market themselves on exclusivity, on being for rich people. And like, people with the aspirations to be rich are of course drawn to that. But this is not like Walmart, right? Or any, whatever. This is like, they're creating spaces that are just so totally for rich people, that are so totally signifying exclusion. You are not rich enough to shop here. You are not rich enough to visit. Like, I mean, I think a lot of us, didn't grow up in a rich family. And so when I go to these places, I feel uncomfortable personally. I do not have Louis Vuitton bag money, and those places are not for me. But then it's one thing if it's one store, if it's one street, it's like, yeah, that's the rich people street. But to take an entire neighborhood and to transform it in this way, to so deliberately exclude so many people from public life, even if they don't have to do it with the, the kind of, police batons, so they probably will, still is, to me, extremely disgusting, and only ever more emblematic of just the absurd degree to which income inequality not only shapes our cities and our lives, but also just how obvious it is, right? How it makes itself known that there is a world for some that does not include most of us. And I think that's frankly disgusting. And I also think that one of the things that is annoying to me is that a lot of the time cities do try to invite these brands by when rents go up, they don't necessarily do anything to lower them. They get them tax cuts. They do whatever. They get on their hands and knees being like, please, Louis Vuitton, come to Chicago or whatever. But the thing is that these companies have so much money and have so much power that they don't actually need cities kowtowing to them. They just do what they want. And I think that this phenomenon, these billions of dollars in real estate signifies that they can just do what they want. They don't need to be invited. They want to be on Fifth Avenue, they buy the building.
Yeah.
Right. And that, I think, really changes the landscape of the game. It's like, yeah, actually, why kowtow to these people? Right? Why kiss their feet when they can do what they want regardless? And I think that is an attitude we as the public need to understand, and also as a form of pushing back. It's like, yeah, don't give tax cuts to these people. Don't invite them in. If they want to be here, they have the money to be here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's even less defensible than when we give out massive or taxpayer money to like sports teams that want to build a new stadium, because there's like there is somewhat of a communal, collective connection around, say the Buffalo Bills, which is just what happened in upstate New York. So I think you should, when you give that kind of money, you should say, well, you can't move, and we own part of the team in that way. But
yeah, I think that if you're going to give money to sports teams, like, you should own the team.
No, I totally agree. But I'm saying it's even less defensible because there's not people who are going to protest the governor's office if there's no Louis Vuitton block in Albany or whatever. So I know it wouldn't be in Albany, but just keeping in the state of New York for this example. But yes. Anyway, Kate, you're doing great work over there at The Nation. You can read this piece called "Luxury Brands Are Buying Our Cities" and the rest of Kate Wagner's work at The Nation. We'll put a link to this down below, and wherever people are watching this, and at majority.fm. Kate Wagner, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, with that, we're going to wrap up the free part of this program and head into the fun half, where we will take your calls, read your IMs, play some clips, have some fun for the most part. Matt, what's happening on Left Reckoning?
Left Reckoning. We're going to be doing a clip show for patrons, patreon.com/Left Reckoning. We had Chip Gibbons on to talk about Julian Assange, and Liza Featherstone to talk about AstroTurf, which is secretly a neoliberal austerity sort of boondoggle, which I didn't really appreciate until now. And also has the added upside of giving you forever chemicals. So enjoy your kids playing soccer out there this summer. Not good, folks, this forever chemicals. So patreon.com/Left Reckoning to get access to that. Also, we got Mike Racine, comedian, coming up next Tuesday, which I am excited about. People
That'll
should
be
check out
fun.
his YouTube special. It's free on YouTube. Go watch it and leave a comment saying Matt Lex sent you, just so he feels better about me as a person. Check that out.
All right, check that out, folks. On ESPN, we spoke about, obviously, the conference finals in the NBA and the NHL, and then we also gave an update on the NCAA and the suit that they just had to settle and what it means for compensation for athletes in the future. YouTube.com/ESPN show for that. Hello to Brandon Sutton.
Hey, Emma.
Whoa.
You have the wrong mic selected.
mic input. Hold.
How about now?
There we go.
Those are the bass tones we appreciate so much from across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
I find my voice quite annoying. That's not an invitation to comment that you do too. Although you can if you like. I'm not sensitive.
You're not censorious like the rest of the radical left.
I'm not sensitive or censorious. Two words that are oftentimes not pronounceable to me with my subtle yet sexy lisp.
Well, a subtle yet sexy lisp. I like that.
Subtle yet sexy.
I've got a little. I can slip into that too, so I'm gonna borrow that for the future. What's happening on the discourse, Brandon?
We have a great episode for you out on the Patreon where we discuss the most recent strikes in Rafah by the Israeli military, as well as a sort of history lesson on Boeing and why they're so terrible. Spoiler alert: it's because they hire black people. I think.
Right. The DEI of it all.
DEI must DIE. I almost fucked that one up. Sorry.
DEI must DIE. There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, check out the discourse. We don't have Matt Binder yet, but check out Scam Economy and Doomed and Leftist Mafia. We will head into the fun half now. The number is 646-257-3920. We'll take your calls and read your IMs. See you there.
3 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now. And I don't think it's going to be the same as it looks like in 6 months from now. And I don't know if it's necessarily going to be better 6 months from now than it is 3 months from now. But I think around 18 months out, we're going to look back and go like, wow. What? What is that going on? It's nuts. Wait a second. Hold on for a second.
The Majority Report.
Emma, welcome to the program.
Hey.
Matt.
What is up, everyone?
Nomi Key.
You did it. Let's go, Brandon.
Let's go, Brandon.
Bradley, you want to say hello?
Sorry to disappoint everyone. I'm just a random guy.
It's all the boys today.
Fundamentally false.
No, I'm sorry. Women's
Stop talking for a second. Now let me finish.
Where is this coming from, dude?
But dude, you want to smoke this 7A?
Yes.
Hi, me? Is it?
Yes.
Is this me?
Is it me?
It is you.
Is this me? Hello, is this me?
I think it is you. Who is you? No sound. Every single freaking day. What's on your mind?
Sports. We can discuss free markets and we can discuss capitalism.
I'm gonna go throw up.
Who libertarians? They're so stupid though. Common sense says, of course.
gobbledygook.
We fucking nailed him.
So what's 79 plus 21?
Challenge Matt.